So, this week we're going to be focusing on the political economy of terrorism. And the basic approach we're going to be taking is one of rational choice. And with that said, I kind of want to talk a little bit about what this rational choice model is and is not before we proceed any further. And part of the reason I want to do that is because I think there's a lot of misconception about what the rational choice model is, certainly amongst academics in other fields, but also amongst economists. And so it probably behooves us to kind of take a look at this. And I want you all to kind of go back to the genocide paper, where Brower and Anderton talk a little bit about what the rational choice model is. And I think one of the points you would find is that the rational choice model is, at the end of the day, it's about process. And that's a point I want to make. So it's this rational choice model is about process. Now, what do I mean by that? So let's kind of say what it's not, right? So when we think about rational choice, we often think about good outcomes, right? That people are making rational choices, they're making good decisions about themselves. Well, no, that's not what it is. Rational choice can have bad outcomes. And then we also think about people making conscious cost benefit analyses, right? Yeah, no, not so much either. So, what do I mean by having a process? Really, what this process means is to have a set of preferences and then step one, step two, trying to achieve the best and subject to constraints. Now, does any of this have to be conscious? No. None of this has to be conscious. In order to do this, do you have to know every single one of your preferences? No, you can learn preferences as we go along. In fact, we often do. So preferences are not preset or even consistent. And then, do we do cost benefit analyses consciously? No, we don't. Nevertheless, we follow this, that kind of the same thing up here, right? And that's the point I guess I'm reiterating. So, what we do is follow this process, this little process here, but the process is not necessarily consistent. And the process, so the process is not necessarily conscious. Preferences might change. Different people can have different preferences. So let's make a note of that. This is going to be important for the terrorism example. So different people can have different preferences. So basically, what does that mean? It means that, I might like kind of, Star Wars, and based on the time that I have, I might want to optimize kind of watching Star Wars movies. Somebody else might love Love Actually, and there's nothing. Actually, I kind of like the movie as well. It's a, you know, it's a good movie. But somebody else might prefer Love Actually over Star Wars, and that's perfectly okay. And they're going to optimize and choose Love Actually. Now, does it mean that my Star Wars preferences are any better than the Love Actually preferences? Well, some people could argue one way, other people might argue the other. But in terms of the process of how we optimize our time to watch these movies, the process to both of us would be exactly the same. And that's kind of the point that I'm making. And really, rational choice is about this process. And so let's kind of make a note of that again. It's a process. So so now that hopefully I've established that rational choice is about a process of making decisions, which could be conscious or unconscious. It's about a process of making decisions where we may or may not have full information about every single thing that we do. But nevertheless, based on the information we have, we try to make the best of it. It's a process. Given all of this, we come up with certain decisions. Now, of course, when we make these decisions, they don't always have to be good decisions as a consequence, right? Maybe we just didn't know that, eating carbs is a bad thing if you're a diabetic. And so you like carbs, you eat carbs. But then when you learn it, sometimes it might be a matter of habit and you like carbs anyway. And so you might still want to keep on eating carbs even if you're a diabetic. We're not here to judge, the value in that. We just recognize that if you have an income constraint, for example, and you have a choice between carbs and vegetables, based on your preferences, you want to eat more carbs. And that's what I observe as an economist, and that's what I report. And so then the question becomes, well, what would happen if the price of carbs went up, right? Well, now we can talk a little bit about, well, if the price of carbs go up, we should consume less carbs. It is these changes that we can actually observe. So let's make a note of that as well. We do not observe this process, but we do observe the effects of this process in changes in human behavior, right? And that's the validation we get for the rational choice approach. So, when a lot of people say, well, people aren't rational in the sense that, people make good decisions, the economist is going to say, yeah, sure, I agree. If a lot of people say, well, people aren't sitting around doing cost benefit analysis, every single minute of the day, the economist is going to say, yeah, I agree. I mean, they certainly aren't doing it consciously. When was the last time you went to a grocery store or something like that and said, you know what, I'm going to calculate the marginal rate of substitution between, tomatoes and potatoes or something like that. Nobody thinks like that. That's crazy, right? Or nobody consciously thinks like that. Yet, when the price for tomatoes go up relative to potatoes, people do buy less tomatoes and buy more potatoes. That's an observable behavior. And that's kind of what gives us confidence in the rational choice model. Is this the only way of thinking about life? Of course not. And more to the point, we also need to understand that people, when we analyze things, we have to analyze them using judgments, right? So what the rational choice process might tell us, for example, is that you're going to eat fewer tomatoes and more potatoes. But then the question is, well, should there be a policy that kind of reduces the price of tomatoes? Well, I don't know. That depends on the kind of judgment you wanna use, right? And the next step that we want to think about once after we understand the process is really think about judgment about the process, right? So this kind of judgment is particularly relevant to policy. So the rational choice process might throw out, well, what are the trade-offs? It identifies trade-offs, observably so, tomatoes or potatoes. But what to do about these trade-offs? Well, that's once again where judgment comes in to play. So, by the way, I'm making a big case for judgment. Where do you learn judgment? It's probably not in class, or at least not in this class, right? In class, we're doing all the academic stuff. We're trying to figure out, what are the trade-offs, what are the models. But which model do I use? What kind of theory of mind should I place when I want to understand the issue of terrorism? Well, that's where judgment comes in. And let me assure you that it doesn't always come from a narrow focus on academics. And here I am, a professor, telling you that the academics is going to tell you all about processes. How do you apply it? Well, that's where judgment is. It's not in the realm of academics, or at least in the realm of my kind of academics. Now, where do you learn judgment? You learn judgment by reading great books. You learn judgment by reading War and Peace. I mean, literally so, by the way. So, in War and Peace, Tolstoy talks about, how scientific models kind of just fall by the wayside in the grand context of war. And that's kind of where judgment comes in. There's sort of the great scene where all these German generals are kind of, with mathematical certainty defined how they can beat Napoleon at Austerlitz. And then this old Russian guy who's like, yeah, you know what? I know that when war happens, everything's going to go to hell. And the best thing we can do right now is go to sleep and have a good night's sleep before tomorrow. And of course, you know what happens at the Battle of Austerlitz, right? Napoleon kicks everybody's butts, even though these German generals had kind of, devised a perfect mathematical model to contain Napoleon and defeat him, right? So that scientific model was blown up by a lack of judgment, basically, right? And so that's a lesson that you don't get, quite frankly, when you're taking exams and kind of doing mathematics and all of that kind of stuff. That's the kind of insight you get by reading great books. That's the insight you get by living in a society, living in barracks. One of the reasons I think VMI cadets are particularly well suited to have a sense of judgment when they go out in the world. And one of the reasons I think VMI cadets do really well is because of all the kind of BS that happens in barracks, right? It makes you aware of and gives you a sense of judgment about how the world really works, what people really are. I mean, you get to know people really well when you're living in close quarters, right? And so I really want to make a case for this notion of judgment. Now, you can't have judgment without the understanding, the scientific process behind it, of course. But at the same time, I want you all to be aware that you might have a perfectly great academic understanding of something and not have any judgment at all. And let me give you an example in the context of terrorism. This famous guy, economist Bruno Frey. So one of his solutions is, one way to kind of, save terrorists attacking the Eiffel Tower, for example, would be to have, build replicas of the Eiffel Tower everywhere. And that way you can sort of divert the attacks to other Eiffel Towers. I don't know what it sounds like to you. Sounds like BS to me. And that's kind of now, if you look at it from a rational choice perspective, that might make perfect sense. But it's also BS because it lacks judgment. It doesn't understand how people might actually behave, right? So with that in mind, let's stop this part of the lecture and we're going to go and try and understand the actual rational choice process, and then we'll look at some of the evidence of all of that.